My name is Mauro Zapatera, and I'm a physician. I did my MD PhD at Harvard Medical School. Now I have a private practice in physical medicine and rehabilitation in Pasadena, California. I'm also working with the Los Angeles VA healthcare system. And I've been trained in polarity therapy, Reiki, and craniosacral therapy as well. So I try to integrate all the trainings that I've had and try to care for patients. So the CSF stands for Cerebral Spinal Fluid. And I did my entire PhD dissertation on this fluid at Harvard Medical School. And essentially the way that it came up was that, believe it or not, I thought that I wanted to do research on cancer. And I was in a cancer lab, and I was not so happy, let's say, in the cancer lab. And my wife says, she comes to me and says, I don't think you're very happy doing what you're doing. I think you need to sort of shift. Let's take a break. And so we took a break and went to Santa Fe together, and she wanted to study polarity therapy, which is a holistic healthcare system. And in one of the classes, we were learning some craniosacral techniques. And the teacher said, you're working here with the cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid is one molecule away from seawater. And I said, well, that's interesting. Like, seawater is an interesting, compound. We have this fluid inside of us that's one molecule away from seawater. So that night I go home and I start kind of reading up on the cerebral spinal fluid, and I realized that there was very little known about this fluid. Very little known about this fluid. It was thought of sort of providing a couple nutrients and sort of buoyancy and protection to the central nervous system. So as we go throughout the training of our polarity, I'm starting to think about going back to Harvard to finish my PhD, or actually to start it. And so I left all the cancer stuff behind and started a lab that was able to actually investigate the question, what is the cerebral spinal fluid? And so in all of us, we have 150 milliliters of cerebral spinal fluid in our brain, inside of our brain, covering the outside of our brain, within the central canal of our spinal cord and around our spinal cord. 150 milliliters is equivalent of almost like half a can of Sprite or Coca-Cola. Every day it turns over about 3 to 4 times. So that means you make 500 milliliters, which is half a liter of cerebral spinal fluid a day. So we're all making this fluid, and it's bathing our entire brain. It's bathing all the insides of our brain, the outsides of our brain. The central canal, the spinal cord actually has a central canal that is bathed completely with CSF all the way down the spinal cord. And the CSF goes, and it actually goes all the way outside the spinal cord, all the way down to the sacrum. So what we wanted to do is essentially ask the question, what does the cerebral spinal fluid do? And so we did some experiments. We were the first to analyze very, very descriptively human embryonic cerebrospinal fluid. And we compared it to rat embryonic cerebrospinal fluid. And the reason why we did that was because I looked at some sections of some embryos. And I saw that in these sections, the cerebrospinal fluid space, the space in these sections was ginormous. It was huge. But the developing brain was this little tiny sliver. And inside was this huge space. And I actually turned to my colleague and I said, there seems like there's something missing here. And he goes, well, no, that's actually, that's where the choroid plexus is, which makes the cerebrospinal fluid. And I said, wow, all that is fluid? Well, what does that do? So first we wanted to analyze what actually was in the fluid. And then we wanted to see what does a fluid do from a developmental perspective. And so we kind of did some experiments where we mixed and matched certain sort of developmentally staged brains with different developmentally staged CSFs to see what does the CSF actually provide to the developing brain. And interestingly, what we found out was, well, first of all, just anatomically, every single neural stem cell in development, which are the cells that develop into neurons to create the entire central nervous system. Every single one of those stem cells at one point in development makes contact with the CSF or is contacting the CSF. So early on in development, you're actually making contact with these cells are making contact with the CSF. There's various cues and growth factors in molecules that are actually released into the CSF that instruct the developing brain on proliferation. How much do I actually need to expand, for instance? Differentiation. When should a cell that's a neural stem cell leave the sort of niche that it's in and go out and become a neuron so it can function, it can have a more specialized function? And so we essentially categorized the embryonic cerebrospinal fluid in humans, as well as we did an extensive analysis in rats, looked at all the proteins, looked at how they changed and varied with time, and what were some of the functions of that. And what we published was essentially that the cerebrospinal fluid creates a niche for stem cells and provides information based on the molecules that are actually in the cerebrospinal fluid, provides information to the brain for proliferation or differentiation. And so that was kind of our major, finding with my PhD work. So in back of that then was, all this kind of interesting training from polarity therapy and craniosacral therapy of this fluid actually having sort of a spiritual component. And during my PhD thesis, one of the books I read was actually the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying by Sogyal Rinpoche. And he actually describes this practice. It's a POA practice, and it's done. It's a Buddhist meditation practice where essentially it's done at the time of death, and it's transferring one's consciousness to the unified Buddha consciousness. And there's a couple sort of indicators that you are successful in the practice. One of which is a tingling at the top of the head. Another one is headache. One is a small little hole appears on the top of the head where a blade of grass can be put into it. The other one is a softening of the fontanelle, which is where all the bones of the skull come together. When we're babies, there's sort of a space there, and you can actually push on it, and that's actually you're pushing on the cerebrospinal fluid. And so when somebody dies, that space actually softens, and you might have a little bit of clear fluid that actually comes out from the head. And so I said, wow, is that cerebrospinal fluid? If this is a successful practice of transferring your consciousness to the Buddha consciousness, and one of the indicators of success in that practice is a clear fluid that emanates from the top of the head, could that actually be cerebrospinal fluid? Because that's the only clear fluid that's present at that. So we actually tried a little bit to get some fluid from practitioners who did this practice, and we weren't able to do that. But those thoughts were kind of in the back of at least my awareness and consciousness when I was doing this work. Combined with sort of my craniosacral training, it became a very powerful fluid. And I started doing, with the guidance from my wife and some of my teachers and stuff like that, some meditations on the cerebrospinal fluid. So for instance, just anatomically, we have a third ventricle, which is essentially like if you go mid-ear length, straight line, and then midline, right in between your brow, there's a fluid-filled space. It's in the midline. It's called the third ventricle. Just in front of the third ventricle is the pituitary gland. Just in back of the third ventricle is the pineal gland. Okay, both those glands are contacting the third ventricle. This third ventricle then opens up. It goes up into the lateral ventricles, which are on either side of the brain, and it goes down all the way the central canal of your spinal cord. Okay, in Kundalini yoga practices and traditions, they describe a hollow canal in the center of the spinal cord where the Kundalini rises and essentially brings the awakening of the Kundalini, or this primal energy, to the third chakra, where then it goes up to the crown chakra and an awakening occurs. The caduceus, for instance, is the midline. So the staff of the caduceus is sort of like a midline. And the two sides of the caduceus are depictions of two of the channels from this yogic practice, which would be the Pingala on one side, the right side, Ida on the other side, the left side, and they cross. And at each crossing with the Sushumna, they make a chakra. The meeting of the heads, which are the heads of the serpent, come together at the midline, and they come right at the third eye. In my belief, the heads of the snake represent one head of the snake represents the pineal gland, the other head of the snake represents the pituitary gland, and the center is the Sushumna, which is the cerebral spinal fluid. When they come and meet together, it's sort of this meeting of the three energies right in the center here. The third eye, sort of the eye of the soul. This place has been called the Crystal Palace. It's been called the Cave of Brahma. And so from that space then, it is my belief that, and some other people's belief as well, that there may be a physical manifestation of the sensation of I am, our beingness, at that space when these energies come and combine, that we have this sort of sensation of beingness. When there's a sense of I amness, when this sense arises, when that inner sense of beingness arises, it's my experience that it's sort of I sense it in my third ventricle or my third eye, and then from there it gets into this expansion, sort of transmitted through the fluid to my entire central nervous system, of which it's just a complete holistic feeling of my sense, or the sense of beingness. And so that's in essence the talk that I give, branching it from, here's the anatomy. As simple as that might be, we have a fluid-filled space right in the middle of our brains that has this fluid. We have a canal that goes down the center of our spinal cord, and when you look up, Sushumna, it sort of describes a hollow canal down the center of the spinal cord. It can transmit information. If you look at flower essences, or the work of Masaru Emoto, who looked at how do fluids store and transmit energy. So here is a fluid that can store, even if we're just looking at a molecule, it's storing the molecule and it's transmitting that molecule to another source, or to another space, being transported via the CSF. It can transmit light, it can transmit vibrations. And in my talk, I use sort of melatonin as an example, because melatonin is synthesized by the pineal gland, and it's synthesized by the pineal gland. It's mostly synthesized. It starts being synthesized when the sun goes down, and it helps us sort of induce a state of sleep. So that's already an altered state of consciousness when you actually fall asleep. So here's this gland. It starts secreting melatonin. There's really good research out there that suggests that the melatonin actually goes into the CSF, and the CSF then distributes it to the brain so that we slowly fall asleep. Interestingly, DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine, is also synthesized in the pineal gland. Rick Strassman found it in 2013 and published a paper. And DMT is used in many shamanic practices to sort of induce altered states of consciousness, as well as it's believed to be hypothesized to be released endogenously during birth, death, and during lucid dreaming. So, if there's these molecules in the CSF, like melatonin, that are being, released into the CSF and then distributed to have this sort of global experience of an altered state of consciousness, like sleep, could then the CSF store and transmit energy from, let's say, a source energy, transmit that energy to our beingness, to our sense, to ourselves, and allow us to experience our sense of self, that pure beingness within us, and be aware of that. So that is sort of the essence of, kind of the views of the CSF that I wanted to present to SANS.